The words came out of my husband's mouth in perfect Japanese, and I felt the wine glass tremble in my hand. We were sitting in the private dining room of Matsuhisa, the kind of restaurant where the bill for one night could cover a year of rent for most people. Soft amber light glowed against dark wood panels. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered like something that had been polished just for us. Everything looked perfect, but the words I was hearing made my stomach turn to ice. "She's quite stupid, actually," Brandon said, laughing as he gestured toward me with his sake cup. "Beautiful, yes, but empty-headed. A good decoration for my arm at events. Nothing more, Mr. Tanaka smiled politely. His expression gave away nothing. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, and his company was deciding whether to put $50 million into Brandon's firm. This dinner was supposed to seal that deal. I kept my face soft, took a small sip of wine, and said nothing. Brandon had no idea I spoke Japanese. He'd never asked about my college years, never looked at my transcripts, never once wondered why a business degree came with a minor in East Asian studies. To him, I was the pretty woman he married 5 years ago, someone to photograph well and host dinner parties. Peels. He kept talking. "And the other woman, Mr. Tanaka asked carefully, switching subjects. "The one you mentioned before?" I kept chewing slowly. My face stayed pleasant. Inside, something was screaming. "Colette is everything Naomi isn't," Brandon said, grinning. "Smart, ambitious, understands the business. We've been together 2 years now. Naomi suspects nothing. 2 years? 2 entire years. Is that wise?" Mr. Tanaka asked. "If your wife discovers this?" Brandon waved a hand. "She won't. And even if she did, what could she do? I had her sign a prenup. She gets nothing if we divorce. She'd go back to being nobody, back to her little nothing life before me." I reached for my water glass. My hand did not shake. Not anymore. The shock had already passed. What replaced it was colder, clearer, and far more useful. "Hey, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. How are you feeling right now? Because I felt all of it too, writing this one. Thank you so much for being here with me. It genuinely means the world. If this story is already pulling at something in you, and I think it is, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, tap that like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It helps this story reach the people who need it more than you know. Now, let's get back to what happens when Naomi finds the one piece of evidence Brandon never expected her to find. 5 years earlier, Naomi Carter had been 25 years old, freshly graduated, and standing at her father's funeral in a black dress that didn't fit right because she'd bought it in a hurry 2 days after he died. Her father had been a lawyer for 30 years, a quiet, careful man who read every contract twice and trusted almost no one with anything in writing. He had raised Naomi alone after her mother passed when she was 12, and the 2 things he gave her, besides love, were a fierce education and an instinct for reading the fine print. He had also given her, almost as an accident of his own interests, a love of languages. He'd spent 2 years working in Tokyo early in his career, long before Naomi was born, and he's filled their small house with language tapes and worn paperback dictionaries instead of the book things other fathers collected. By the time Naomi was 16, she could hold a basic conversation in Japanese. By the time she finished her business degree, she had quietly added a minor in East Asian studies, partly out of love for her father, and partly because some part of her had always understood that the ability to understand what people say when they think no one understands them is its own kind of power. She never advertised it. It wasn't the sort of thing that came up naturally in a business meeting, and after her father died, she found she didn't have the energy to explain a piece of herself to people who hadn't known him. It became, without her ever deciding it should, a quiet and private thing, something that belonged only to her. She met Brandon Walsh 3 months after the funeral, at a fundraising gala she'd attended mostly because a college friend insisted she get out of the apartment. He was magnetic in the particular way that wealthy, ambitious men often are, all confidence, all forward motion, never still. He took her to dinners she couldn't afford on her entry-level salary, told her she was the smartest woman in any room he'd been in, and proposed after 8 months with a ring that cost more than her father's denture, wife insurance payout. She said yes, in part because she was 26 and grieving and tired of being the only steady thing in her own life, and in part because Brandon, for all his faults, had a way of making a person feel chosen. It would take her years to understand the difference between being chosen and being acquired. While Naomi spent those early years quietly building a life around him, managing his household, smoothing his social calendar, learning the names of every investor's spouse, Brandon spent them building an image, a stable home life, a beautiful, devoted wife, the kind of optics that made venture capitalists feel safe handing him money. Also, while Naomi was filing away every dismissive comment, every "don't worry about the details, sweetheart," every meeting she was quietly excluded from, Brandon was growing more convinced that she was exactly what he's built her to be in his mind: decorative, harmless, easy to ignore. By the time of their second anniversary, Naomi had stopped correcting him when he mispronounced the name of her old university program. It was easier to let him believe what he wanted to believe. And by the third anniversary, she had stopped trying to be understood by him at all, redirecting that part of herself into the non-profit work he found mildly embarrassing and the friendships he found unnecessary. She didn't know yet how useful all of that, the silence, the underestimation, the language she'd never mentioned, would eventually become. The night after the Matsuhisa dinner, Naomi didn't sleep. She sat in the home office Brandon rarely used. He preferred his real office, the one with people in it, and she opened the small fireproof box her father had left her. Inside were old documents, his bar card, a few photographs, and a manila folder labeled, in his handwriting, "For Naomi. Read before you sign anything." She had read it once before, the week of her wedding, distracted and in love, and certain she'd never need it. Now she read it again, slowly, every clause. The prenuptial agreement Brandon had insisted on, and that her father had quietly, carefully, revised before she signed, contained one sentence: Brandon had never bothered to have his own lawyer's double-check, because he assumed a grieving 25-year-old wouldn't understand what she was signing. Clause 14-B. This agreement shall be rendered void in its entirety in the event of marital infidelity by either party, substantiated by credible evidence, at which point all marital assets shall be subject to equitable division under state law. Her father had read every line. Twice, Naomi sat very still for a long moment. Pause. The apartment was very quiet. She needed proof. Not suspicion. Not a feeling in her stomach. Proof that would hold up somewhere, a judge could see it. The next morning, she called the one person who had never lied to her in 5 years of marriage, Diane, the housekeeper, who had worked for the Walsh family for over a decade, long before Naomi arrived, and who had seen things she'd never said out loud. "Mrs. Walsh," Diane said carefully, over coffee in the kitchen, "I've kept quiet because it wasn't my place. But if you're asking me directly, yes, there've been calls, deliveries, a woman's perfume in the guest house that isn't yours." "How long?" Diane hesitated. "Longer than you'd want to hear." That was the first crack, the first person willing to say, out loud, what Naomi already knew. Diane had worked for the Walsh family since before Brandon and Naomi ever met, which meant she had a decade of small, quiet observations that nobody had ever asked her to share. She told Naomi about the guest house lights that stayed on until 2 in the morning, when Brandon claimed he was working late at the office across town. She told her about a black car that picked him up some Friday afternoons, the same driver each time, always parked at the end of the block instead of the front door. "I almost said something a year ago," Diane admitted, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "But it wasn't my place, and I didn't have anything you could call proof, just a feeling." "You have more than you think," Naomi said. "Would you write it down? Dates? Anything specific you remember? Not to use, unless I need it. Just so it isn't only a feeling anymore," Diane agreed. It took her 2 days to produce 3 handwritten pages, careful and precise, the handwriting of a woman who had learned long ago that the truth mattered more than how comfortable it made other people. That was the moment Naomi understood something her father must have known his whole career. The truth rarely announces itself all at once. It arrives in small, careful pieces, brought by people willing to risk something to hand them over. The second came from an unlikely place: Marcus, a young associate at Brandon's firm who Naomi had met at a company holiday party 2 years earlier, and stayed in touch with out of simple kindness, the kind she extended to people Brandon overlooked. Marcus owed her nothing, except that she'd once spent 20 minutes talking him through a panic attack in a hallway, while Brandon ignored him entirely. "Mrs. Walsh," Marcus said over the phone, voice low, "I shouldn't be telling you this, but there are expense reports, hotel charges, gifts charged to a marketing budget that don't track to any actual campaign. If anyone audited those books seriously, it wouldn't just be a personal problem for him. Financial conspiracy and personal betrayal, tangled together. That was the mystery engine now fully active, and it ran in two directions at once. What Brandon had done to her, and what Brandon had done to the company whose investors trusted him. Naomi began writing things down. Dates, numbers, 14 unexplained hotel charges in 18 months. 7 trips logged as client development with no client names attached. $41,000 in gifts that appeared nowhere in any real marketing campaign. She met Marcus twice more over the following weeks, always somewhere far from the office, a diner near the highway, a park bench where neither of them needed to whisper. He brought more each time, a vendor invoice that didn't match any actual vendor, a calendar entry marked only with initials, a company credit card statement that someone with access to the books had quietly forwarded to him months earlier, before he understood what he was looking at. "I keep telling myself I should stop," Marcus admitted one afternoon, hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup he wasn't drinking. "If anyone finds out I gave you this, I lose my job. Maybe more than my job." "You don't owe me anything," Naomi said. "If you want to walk away, I'll understand completely." He was quiet for a long moment. "You were the only person at that company who ever asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. I'm not walking away. It was a small thing, the kind of decency that rarely gets remembered in stories like this one, but it was also the difference between a feeling and a case." Marcus's documents, paired with Diane's handwritten pages, gave Naomi something she hadn't had before, a timeline. Not just an affair, but a pattern, stretching back further than even Brandon himself might have remembered, of money moving in directions no shareholder had ever approved. She built a folder, then a second one. She labeled them carefully, the way her father had labeled the folder he left for her. Methodical, unemotional, built for someone else's eyes eventually, not just her own. She didn't confront him, not yet. She smiled at dinner. She asked about his day. She let him believe, completely, that nothing had changed. The smoking gun. 3 weeks after the restaurant dinner, Brandon left for a 2-day trip. Investor meetings, he said, though Naomi now read every word he said, the way her father had taught her to read contracts. Assume nothing, verify everything. She went into his home office while he was gone. Not snooping, she told herself that, and stopped pretending it mattered whether it was true. She was past needing his permission to know her own life. In the back of his desk drawer, beneath a stack of old business cards, she found a single printed email, the kind of thing a careless man keeps because he's never once imagined being caught. It was from Brandon to Colette, dated 8 months earlier. "Ensure the wire transfer happens before Naomi sees the year-end statements. If she asks, tell her it's for the foundation. She won't check." Naomi read it 3 times. Pause. Her hands were steady. The shaking had stopped weeks ago. She photographed the email, photographed every page of Marcus's flagged expense reports, photographed Diane's signed written statement, and placed the originals back exactly where she found them. That night, she called the only person left who could turn paper into a weapon, a lawyer. Sarah Chen had a reputation for being quiet in negotiations and devastating in court. She'd built her practice on cases exactly like this one, powerful men who assumed their wives were too soft, too dependent, or too in love to ever fight back. "Show me everything," Sarah said. Naomi did. Sarah read the prenup clause twice, the way Naomi's father would have. Then she looked up. "He thought a 25-year-old in grief wouldn't read the fine print," she said. "Your father made sure that mistake would cost him everything." Deepening, there was a third person who came forward, though not in the way Naomi expected. Her name was Lena, and for 2 years she had been Brandon's executive assistant before Colette replaced her in that role and, eventually, in his bed. Lena had quit 8 months earlier, citing burnout, though the truth, Naomi would learn, was closer to disgust. She'd seen the same calendar entries Marcus had flagged, the same hotel charges, and she'd watched Brandon promote Colette over more qualified colleagues, twice in 1 year, each time dressed up as a strategic restructuring. Naomi found her through a mutual contact at the nonprofit board, of all places, a small, almost comic irony that the network Brandon dismissed as Naomi's little project was the very thing that connected her to the proof that would end his career. "I have emails," Lena said, the first time they spoke, sitting across from each other in a coffee shop 2 towns over from where either of them lived, deliberately far from anyone who might recognize them, internal ones. Nothing as direct as what you might already have, but enough to show a pattern: preferential treatment, performance reviews altered after the fact, 2 other employees pushed out around the same time Colette was promoted past them. "Why are you giving me this?" Lena considered the question longer than Naomi expected. "Because I spent 2 years pretending I didn't see what I saw, and it made me sick in a way that had nothing to do with burnout. I'd like to stop pretending." It was the same sentence, in different words, that Diane and Marcus had each said in their own way. "I'd like to stop pretending." Naomi began to understand that Brandon's carelessness wasn't only a personal failing, it was structural. He had built a life on the quiet complicity of people he never thought to ask permission from, and one by one, those people were choosing to stop providing it. With Lena's records added to Diane's statement and Marcus's documents, Sarah Chen's case stopped looking like a personal grievance and started looking like exactly what it was: a pattern of misconduct stretching across a marriage, a workplace, and a balance sheet, with a single common thread running through the center of it. There were quieter moments, too, in those weeks of gathering evidence, moments that had nothing to do with the case at all. Naomi spent an entire Sunday afternoon at the nonprofit's small office, helping 2 of the women she mentored prepare loan applications, and for 3 full hours she didn't think about Brandon once. It was the first time in over a year she'd felt like a whole person, instead of someone managing a slow-motion collapse. "You seem different lately," one of the women, Priya, told her, packing up her folder at the end of the session. "Lighter, somehow, even though I know things can't be easy right now." "I think I'm remembering who I was before I got small," Naomi said, and was a little surprised to hear herself say it out loud. She went home that evening feeling something close to ready: the crisis. For a while it seemed almost too easy: gather evidence quietly, file when ready, end it cleanly. But 2 days before Sarah planned to file, Brandon came home early from a trip he wasn't supposed to be back from yet, and Naomi understood, the moment she saw his face, that someone had warned him. "Marcus says you've been asking him questions," Brandon said, voice flat. "Diane's been acting strange." "What exactly do you think you know, Naomi?" For one long moment, every plan she'd built felt fragile. He was still bigger than her in every way the world measured power: money, lawyers, reputation. What if the clause didn't hold up? What if a judge sided with the man who built the company instead of the wife who married into it? She didn't answer him. She walked out of the room and didn't speak to him for 3 days. On the 3rd night, an envelope appeared under her bedroom door. Not a confrontation, a letter, in his own handwriting, the kind of thing he hadn't written since he proposed. "Naomi, I know what you think you've found, and I know I can't talk my way out of it. I won't try. I've spent 5 years assuming you were exactly what I needed you to be, and I never once asked who you actually were. That's on me, not you. I would have stopped the affair the moment it started if my brain understood what I was risking. Not the money, not the company. You. I would have given up Colette, the deals, all of it, even if the hardest price was admitting I built my whole life on the wrong foundation. I don't expect you to believe that now. I'm not sure I'd believe me either." Naomi read it twice. Then she folded it, placed it in the same fireproof box that held her father's claws, and called Sarah in the morning. "File it," she said. The confrontation. The hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning, in a courtroom with too much fluorescent light and not enough air. Brandon arrived with 3 lawyers and the same confidence he'd worn the night at Matsuhisa, as if confidence alone had ever been the same thing as innocence. Sarah Chen was not loud. She didn't need to be. She produced the expense reports first: the 14 hotel charges, the 7 phantom client trips, the $41,000 in unaccounted gifts. Brandon's own outside counsel, brought in by the board once word of a potential fraud reached the investors, sat very still as the numbers were read aloud. "Mr. Walsh," Sarah said, "isn't it true that these funds, logged as marketing expenditures, were in fact used to support a personal relationship with Miss Colette Marsh?" "I was supporting her career," Brandon said. "She's a talented professional. At the expense of your company's integrity? At the expense of your marriage?" At the expense of the $50 million investment partner sitting across from you at dinner the night you called your wife stupid, in a language you assumed she didn't speak? A murmur moved through the gallery. One of the board members shifted in his seat, the small movement of a man quietly recalculating how much he still trusted the person across from him. Brandon's lawyer rose. "Objection. Counsel is editorializing." "Withdrawn," Sarah said evenly, "though I notice no one in this room disputes the underlying fact." The judge allowed her to continue. Diane's written statement came next. The late lights, the unfamiliar car, the perfume that didn't belong to anyone who lived in that house. On paper it was a small thing, but it landed with the particular weight that comes from a person who has nothing to gain by lying and everything to lose by speaking at all. Then Marcus's documents, the vendor invoice that matched no real vendor, the calendar entries marked only with initials, the credit card statement someone above him had quietly tried to bury, the company's own outside auditor, present at the board's request rather than Naomi's, confirmed under questioning that the numbers lined up exactly with what Marcus had flagged months earlier, before it disappeared from anyone's inbox. That detail alone shifted the room. This was no longer simply a marriage falling apart in public. It was a CEO who had misused company funds to hide an affair from his wife, his board, and the investors who had trusted him with their capital. Then came the email. Sarah read it aloud, slowly, giving every word its full weight. "Ensure the wire transfer happens before Naomi sees the year-end statements. If she asks, tell her it's for the foundation. She won't check." Pause. The room went very quiet. "Mr. Walsh," Sarah said, "you assumed your wife wouldn't check. Why?" Brandon hesitated. "I don't know. I suppose you thought she was exactly what you told Mr. Room. She was. Decoration. Harmless. Easy to manage." He didn't answer. Brandon looked at Naomi, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in over a year. Something flickered across his face, not quite shame, not quite fear, but close enough to both that the difference no longer mattered. "I made mistakes," he said. "Mistakes," Sarah repeated, "or calculated choices that benefited you and Miss Adrenum at the cost of everyone who trusted you, your investors, your employees, and your wife?" He had no answer that didn't sound exactly like what it was. By the time the hearing reached its second hour, even Brandon's own counsel had stopped objecting. The case had stopped being only about a marriage. It had become, in the eyes of the board members watching from the gallery, a liability question, and a man who hid money from his wife had very plainly hidden money from them too. Naomi stood when it was her turn, and she said only one thing, quiet and clear enough that the whole room heard it. "I stayed silent for 2 years while you decided I was too foolish to notice. I am not foolish. I am patient." Is patience really the thing you want to call weakness now? No one in that courtroom mistook it for weakness again. You've come this far with me, and that means more than you probably realize. Stories like Naomi's only survive because people like you choose to carry them forward. If this one has moved you, if any part of it stirred something true, this is the moment to act on it. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. Like this video to let me know it mattered. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And drop a comment telling me which line hit you hardest. Now let's see Naomi's story through to the end. Resolution. The prenup, predictably, did not survive contact with Clause 14-B. Equitable division under state law meant exactly what Naomi's father had quietly engineered it to mean 5 years earlier. In a conference room, Brandon never bothered to sit in himself. He had signed a document without reading the one clause that would eventually cost him half of everything, because he had never imagined needing to read it carefully. He had assumed, the way he assumed most things, that the people around him would simply absorb whatever he decided and move on. Brandon resigned from the company within the month, after the board's own internal review confirmed what the courtroom had already shown them: the misused funds, the buried audit flags, the pattern Lena's records had helped expose. His reputation, once his most valuable asset, became the thing no one wanted near their name. 2 other investors quietly pulled their commitments before the ink on the original deal ever said dried. Colette's career in the industry quietly ended. No firm wanted the headline that came attached to her, and within a year she had moved to another city entirely, starting over somewhere nobody asked questions about her past. Naomi kept the non-profit she'd built, the one Brandon had dismissed for years as her little project, the one that had, by the time of the trial, helped over 300 women start their own small businesses with microloans and mentorship. In the months after the settlement, applications to the program tripled. Word had spread, quietly, about the woman who ran it, and what she'd survived to keep doing the work. Naomi never spoke publicly about the trial. She didn't need to. The work spoke for itself, the way it always had. She sold the house. She didn't need its size, its silence, or the particular kind of loneliness that comes from living in a place built to impress people rather than shelter a life. The day the sale closed, she stood in the empty living room one last time and felt, for the first time in years, nothing at all. No grief, no relief. Just the quiet, settled feeling of a door closing on something that had already ended a long time before the paperwork caught up. 8 months later, she sat on the porch of a smaller home in a neighborhood that actually felt like a neighborhood. Children on bicycles, a maple tree out front just beginning to turn gold, neighbors who waved without needing to know who she used to be married to. Diane still visited on Sundays, no longer as staff but simply as a friend who had, in the end, given Naomi more than any lawyer could buy. Marcus eventually left finance altogether and went back to school for something he actually wanted to do. He sent Naomi a card the day he graduated, and she kept it in the same fireproof box that once held her father's claws. Lena started her own small consulting practice, helping companies audit exactly the kind of internal blind spots Brandon's company had ignored for years, and the two women still had coffee every few months. Half friendship, half reunion, of people who had survived the same storm from different angles. A year after the sale, Naomi married again, quietly, without cameras, to a man named David who had known her for exactly 1 year and had still never once needed her to be smaller than she was. He was an architect, methodical in the same quiet way her father had been, the kind of man who read every document twice, not because he distrusted her, but because it was simply how he moved through the world. He had met Naomi at one of her nonprofit's fundraising events, hadn't realized at first who she was, and by the time he found out, it no longer mattered. He had already decided he liked the version of her that didn't come with a business card. The wedding was small, no ballroom, no investors, no language anyone needed to hide behind, just people who actually loved her, standing in a backyard, while the late afternoon light came down gold through the trees, the same kind of golden light that had once filled the dining room at Matsuhisa the night everything fell apart. Except now, it meant something entirely different. The same warmth, transformed. 2 years after the trial, Naomi gave birth to a daughter. They named her Hana, a name that meant flower in the language her first husband had once assumed. She'd never bothered to learn, spoken now in a home where no one ever needed to hide a single word from anyone else. Naomi would tell Hana, when she was old enough to understand, that the most dangerous thing anyone ever did was assume a quiet woman had nothing to say. She would tell her about her grandfather, the lawyer who read every line twice, and how that single habit, passed down without ceremony, had quietly saved her mother's entire future. She would tell her about Diane and Marcus and Lena, ordinary people who chose, one at a time, to stop pretending they hadn't seen what they'd seen, and how that, more than any lawyer's argument, was what had actually turned the tide. And years later, when people asked Hana about her mother, about the courtroom, the prenup, the dinner in Japanese that started it all, she would only smile and say, "My mother never raised her voice once." She didn't have to. She'd already read every word, long before anyone thought to check. She mocked nothing. She forgave what was worth forgiving, and let go of the rest. And she built, from the wreckage of one careless dinner at a restaurant with too much gold light and not enough honesty, a life that finally, fully, completely belonged to her. If Naomi's story moved you tonight, if her patience and her quiet strength resonated with something in your own life, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you so much for watching, and for being here until the very end.